Politics, it can be a wild ride. One minute things seem, I don't know, predictable, and then bam, something happens that just throws the whole country into chaos.
Yeah, totally unpredictable sometimes.
And that's exactly what we're looking at today, a deep dive into a moment like that. We're talking about the assassination of Vijaya Kumaratunga on February 16th, 1988.
Okay, so Kumaratunga, he wasn't just a politician, right? He was like a huge movie star. I mean, we're talking over 120 films, won tons of those most popular actor awards.
Right.
So when he entered politics, I mean, he already had this massive built-in audience.
Right. I mean, talk about star power. And of course, off-screen, his life was just as closely tied to the course of Sri Lankan history. Like, think about it. He was married to Chandrika Kumaratunga, who went on to become the president. To really get into all of this, we've pulled together a whole bunch of sources.
We have, yeah. We're looking at a critique of the Presidential Commission of Inquiry report on the assassination. And then there's the Wikipedia pages, both for Vijaya Kumaratunga himself and for the assassination itself. Plus, we've got articles from Roar Media and Colombo Telegraph.
And we even have parts of the actual Presidential Commission of Inquiry report. So in this deep dive, we're hoping to, well, first, just lay out everything that happened surrounding Kumaratunga's death.
Right. The when, where, how, all that.
But then we also want to dig into the different theories, the different perspectives about who might have been responsible and especially the political climate at the time.
Like, what made this even possible in the first place?
Exactly. So to kick things off, I think it's important to understand the political situation in Sri Lanka back in the late 80s. Things were volatile, to say the least.
Yeah, it was a tense time. You had the Janatha Vimukthi Peramuna, the JVP, and they were basically launching a full-on insurgency in the South. They wanted to overthrow the government, and they were pretty ruthless.
Right. I mean, they weren't afraid to use violence, assassinations of politicians, attacks on security forces, even violence against civilians. It was a very dangerous period.
And Kumaratunga, he was right in the middle of all this. He was a strong supporter of the Indo-Lanka Peace Accord that was signed in 1987. And he was really outspoken in his criticism of the JVP's armed rebellion. It's interesting, though, because while his party, the SLNP, was in favor of the peace accord, they weren't totally on board with India's involvement. They were actually opposed to having Indian troops on Sri Lankan soil.
Yeah, it's more complex than just being pro or anti-accord. And to make things even more complicated, Kumaratunga was facing some very real threats.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, he was getting death threats from the Deshapremi Janatha Viyaparaya, or DJV, which, for those who don't know, that was pretty much the military wing of the anti-Indian JVP.
So these weren't just empty threats. This was serious stuff. And despite the danger, he kept speaking out against them.
He didn't back down, which is pretty remarkable given the circumstances. And after his assassination, the DJV actually put out this leaflet trying to justify their actions. They said they killed him because he supported the Indo-Lanka Accord, the Indian peacekeeping force, and the provincial councils.
And they even went so far as to accuse him of being a CIA agent. It just shows how intense the feelings were around his political views.
Definitely. And it's important to note his political background, too, because it wasn't static. He started out in the Lanka Samaj Party, very socialist, Trotskyist, focused on workers' rights. Pretty big deal in Sri Lankan politics at the time. Then he joined the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, SLFP, more of a mainstream party.
Right, so he kind of moved across the political spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. But then, eventually, he breaks away from the SLFP and forms his own party, the SLMP. And in his last public speech, which was just weeks before the assassination, he actually criticizes all the big players. The UNP, the SLFP, the JVP. He's basically saying that none of them are really addressing the country's problems.
Wow, so he's really staking out his own position. He's not afraid to call out the establishment.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Which makes what happened next even more shocking.
Absolutely. So now we come to February 16th, 1988, the day of the assassination.
That's a pretty harrowing story. So Kumaratunga is leaving his house in Polangoda, Colombo. It's around 12:20 p.m. And two guys on a motorcycle pull up.
So it's a drive-by shooting, essentially?
Pretty much. The guy in the back, who turns out to be Lionel Ranasinghe, alias Gamini, he's the shooter. And the weapon he used was a Type 56 assault rifle.
Wait, a Type 56? That's a pretty serious piece of hardware.
It is, yeah. And get this, it was reportedly stolen from the bodyguard of a UNP government minister. So right away you have to wonder, how did these guys get their hands on a weapon like that?
I mean, that's a pretty big red flag, right? It suggests some sort of connection, or at least raises questions about how it ended up with the assassins.
Exactly. And the attack itself was, well, it was brutal. They shot Kumaratunga twice in the back while he was near his gate. He fell, And then Ranasinghe gets off the motorcycle and shoots him again, this time in the head.
At close range.
Yeah. The autopsy later confirmed he died from the injuries to his neck and head.
It's a really disturbing image.
It is. And in the aftermath, investigators found 14 empty shell casings at the scene. And tragically, Sarathupalli, who was with Kumaratunga at the time, he was also wounded and later died.
It wasn't just Kumaratunga who was targeted then. It was almost like a message they were trying to send.
Yeah, potentially. And the public reaction was huge. The government declared national mourning, and his funeral drew massive crowds, probably the biggest ever seen in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And it was the first funeral ever to be broadcast live on TV there, which just shows the impact he had.
So the investigation kicks off. Where do they start?
Well, they eventually tracked down a guy named Sajith. And through him, they got to Lionel Ranasinghe, the shooter, who was known to be a JVP activist. He was arrested in March 1989, but initially for a bunch of robberies.
So not even for the assassination.
Not at first, but then during his interrogation, he confesses to the CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, and that's when the whole story about Kumaratunga's murder comes out.
So he admits to the assassination?
Yes, and get this, he also admits to having killed a total of 43 people on the orders of the JVP.
43. So this guy was basically a hitman for the JVP.
It seems that way, yeah. In his confession, it's pretty chilling. He said they specifically told him to destroy Kumaratunga's face. He was even scared of being recognized by Chandrika Kumaratunga, who apparently saw the whole thing happen from the gate.
Wow, that's terrifying.
Definitely. But then the story gets even more complicated because Ranasinghe himself ends up getting killed by the police. The official story is that he was trying to escape, but there are a lot of people who think it was actually an extrajudicial killing. Some even say it was ordered by Minister Ranjan Wijeratne.
So now we've got another layer of mystery on top of everything else.
Right, which brings us to the Presidential Commission of Inquiry. Chandrika Kumaratunga, after she became president in 1994, she sets up this commission to look into her husband's assassination. I mean, can you blame her? She obviously suspected the previous UNP government might have been involved somehow.
Yeah, I can see why she'd want answers. And what did the commission find?
So their report comes out in 1996. And they basically say there's a prima facie case for indirect involvement by President Ranasinghe Premadasa. Their reasoning was that he might have had a motive, and they thought there was evidence of the original investigation being suppressed.
So they're not saying he directly ordered the hit, but that he might have created an environment where it could happen.
That's the gist of it. They also pointed fingers at the National Security Minister at the time, Ranjan Wijeratne, saying he interfered with the police investigation.
Okay, so it sounds like they're implicating high-level figures in the government.
They are, yeah. In fact, their conclusion was that Premadasa, Gamini Lokuj, and Ranjan Wijeratne should be considered responsible for Kumaratunga's death.
Strong stuff. But I imagine those findings didn't go unchallenged.
Oh no, they were highly controversial. There were a lot of criticisms leveled at the commission, both about the way it was set up and the conclusions it reached.
So what were some of the main criticisms?
Well, for one thing, the law the commission was operating under, the Special Presidential Commissions of Inquiry Act of 1978, a lot of people thought that law was problematic. They said it violated basic principles of a fair trial.
How so?
Well, the judges on these commissions were appointed directly by the president, so there were questions about their impartiality. Plus, the commission could use hearsay evidence, which isn't allowed in a regular court, and there was no right to appeal their decisions.
So basically, the deck was kind of stacked against anyone accused by the commission.
Pretty much, yeah. And on top of that, both Premadasa and Wijeratne were dead by this point, so they couldn't even defend themselves.
So there was no one to speak for them at the inquiry.
Exactly. And beyond the legal issues, there were also criticisms about the report itself. Some people thought it was too emotional, too biased in favor of Kumaratunga.
Like how so?
Well, for example, they kept calling him Vijaya throughout the report, like they were close personal friends. And they described his body in very flattering terms, which just seemed inappropriate in an official report.
Yeah, I can see how that could be perceived as bias. It's supposed to be a neutral investigation, not a eulogy.
Right. And then there's the whole issue of evidence. Critics argued that the commission didn't really have any solid evidence directly linking Premadasa to the actual assassins.
So basically, they were saying it was all circumstantial.
To a large extent, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And they also questioned the motive the commission attributed to Premadasa. They said Kumaratunga was probably more of a threat to the SLFP's votes than the UNP's.
So maybe Premadasa wouldn't have benefited from getting rid of him.
That's what they were arguing. And maybe the most significant criticism was that the commission basically ignored any evidence pointing to the JVP.
Even though the assassin himself confessed to being a JVP hitman?
Yeah, they kind of brushed that aside. They downplayed Ranasinghe's confession and the JVP's obvious motive, given their opposition to Kumaratunga and the death threats. Even a former Supreme Court Justice, A.C. Alley's, he came out and said he thought the commission let their emotions cloud their judgment and that they relied too much on a flawed police investigation.
Wow. So even within the legal community, there were serious doubts about the commission's findings.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this wasn't the only theory out there. Chandrika Kumaratunga herself, right after the assassination, she apparently thought the CIA might have been involved.
The CIA, that's a whole other level of conspiracy.
It is, yeah. And to this day, people are still debating who was really behind the killing. There are all sorts of conflicting accounts. One interesting one comes from Jayantha Melmarachi, whose father was a UNP minister.
What's his take?
He claims that Lionel Ranasinghe, the assassin, confessed to him personally that he got his orders from a high-ranking JVP committee. And those orders specifically included obliterating Kumaratunga's face.
So that detail keeps coming up. It's almost like they wanted to make sure he was beyond recognizable.
Right, which is pretty chilling. And it's worth noting that a lot of people saw Kumaratunga's death as a huge loss for ethnic unity in Sri Lanka. They thought he could have bridged the divides between different groups in the country.
So his death wasn't just a political assassination, it was also a symbolic blow to the idea of a unified Sri Lanka.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Despite everything the commission uncovered, no one was ever prosecuted for Kumaratunga's murder.
So there was never any real justice for him.
No, not legally anyway. And that just adds to the mystery and the unanswered questions surrounding this whole event.
So where does that leave us? What are the main takeaways from all this? Well, I think the biggest one is just how complex and murky this whole thing is. You've got conflicting narratives, allegations of political interference, and no clear answers about who was ultimately responsible.
And at the center of it all, you have Vijaya Kumaratunga, this incredibly popular figure, both as a film star and a politician, whose life was cut short in a brutal act of violence.
Right. And we can't forget the context. This all happened during one of the most violent periods in Sri Lanka's history, with a JVP insurgency raging in the south.
And you have the assassin's confession linking the JVP to the murder, but then you also have the Presidential Commission pointing the finger at the UNP government, even though those findings were controversial and never led to any legal action.
Yeah, it's a tangled web. And I think this case really makes you think about the challenges of uncovering the truth, especially when it comes to political assassinations. There's so much at stake, so much room for manipulation and spin.
It's like, how do you separate fact from fiction when everyone has an agenda? And then there's the role of public perception, how political maneuvering can shape the narrative around these events.
And in the end, even though we've gone through all this information, we're still left with so many questions. And I think that's the most important takeaway for me. The assassination of Vijaya Kumaratunga continues to cast a long shadow over Sri Lankan politics and society, and the search for truth, well, it's still ongoing.
It's a story that continues to resonate even decades later, and I think it challenges us to think critically about the information we're given, to question the official narratives, and to never stop seeking the truth, no matter how elusive it may be.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that history is rarely simple, and that even the most shocking events often have hidden depths and complexities waiting to be explored. And that exploration, well, that's what we're all about. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you food for thought and maybe even inspired you to do some digging of your own.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep learning.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.
Bye for now.
See ya.